My wife, Yvonne, was barely in the ground when my daughter-in-law, Savannah, approached me in the pouring rain. Her voice, sharp and devoid of warmth, cut through the grief. "You need to start packing your belongings tonight, Warren. Terrence and I have already found a budget-assisted living facility for you on the other side of the county. The moving truck arrives on Monday, so do not make this difficult." I stood there, 73 years old, the cold Atlanta rain feeling like tiny frozen needles against my dark skin. 45 years of marriage, 45 years of building a quiet life, raising our son Terrence, and sharing every morning coffee. Now it was just me, alone in the clearing storm, over the fresh earth that covered Yvonne. The cemetery was emptying out, but Savannah's impatience was palpable. She wore a tailored black designer dress that cost more than my first car, and her blonde hair was shielded by a massive custom umbrella. She offered no comfort, no sorrow. She stepped closer, invading my space. "Did you hear me, old man?" she snapped, leaning in so I could smell her overwhelming, expensive perfume. "You are not staying in that house. It is way too big for a senile retired mailman who cannot even remember where he left his slippers. Terrence and I are taking over the property. We have plans for it, so pack up your old junk and get ready to leave." She thought I was just a broken-down old African-American man, suffering from cognitive decline. She thought I was nothing but a fragile, retired postal worker who spent his days feeding pigeons. That was the persona I had carefully maintained for the last 2 decades. I played the part perfectly because it kept my family safe, and it kept people from asking questions. Savannah had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. She didn't know that before I put on a postal uniform to take care of my sick child in the 90s, I was a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. I spent my prime years hunting down corporate embezzlers, dismantling money laundering rings, and destroying arrogant criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. I knew how to read people, and looking at Savannah, I saw nothing but pure, unadulterated greed. I didn't yell at her. I didn't defend myself. I just let the cold rain wash over my face, maintaining my absolute silence. My refusal to argue infuriated her. She opened her mouth to scream another insult, but before she could speak, a heavy, calloused hand clamped down firmly on my shoulder. It was Victor, my next-door neighbor, an old white Marine veteran who has lived beside me for 30 years. He is a man of very few words, but he possesses a fierce loyalty that you don't find easily these days. "The man just buried his wife, Savannah," Victor growled, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Back off before I forget my manners and throw that fancy umbrella into the mud." Savannah scoffed, her face twisting into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust. "You people are all the same," she muttered, turning on her heel. "Be ready by Monday, Warren, or I will have the state remove you by force." She marched away toward Terrence's shiny luxury car. Victor didn't let me watch her leave. He gently gripped my arm and guided me toward his rusted old pickup truck parked on the edge of the cemetery grass. He opened the passenger door and helped me inside, shielding me from the heavy rain. I expected Victor to drive us back to our quiet suburban street so I could sit in my empty house and mourn my wife. But when he started the engine, he didn't turn toward the suburbs. He merged onto the highway and headed straight toward the industrial district on the far outskirts of Atlanta. We drove in complete silence for 40 minutes. The rhythmic wiping of the windshield wipers was the only sound between us. "Where are we going, Victor?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse from crying earlier that morning. Victor kept his eyes on the wet road, his jaw clenched tight. He didn't answer me immediately. He drove deep into a maze of abandoned factories and forgotten warehouses, where the city seemed to completely disappear. He pulled the old truck up to a dilapidated brick building with faded paint and a heavy steel roll-up door. He killed the engine, and the truck rattled into silence. Victor reached deep into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single heavy brass key. He held it in his hand for a moment, looking down at it before handing it over to me. "Yvonne came to my house a month ago," Victor said, his voice incredibly heavy with emotion. "It was right after the doctors told her the cancer had spread to her brain. She was weak and she could barely walk, but her eyes were burning with a terrifying kind of fire. She handed me this key, Warren. She made me swear on my life and my honor that if she didn't make it through the winter, I would bring you to this exact location immediately after they put her in the ground. I took the cold brass key, staring at my old friend in complete confusion. Why didn't she just tell me? I asked. Because she knew you would try to stop her, Victor replied, turning to look me directly in the eyes. She said, "This is something only you can know." She was very specific, Warren. "You must never tell your son Terrence about this place. Not until you understand exactly what you are dealing with." She said, "Terrence is completely blind to the snake sleeping in his bed." My heart began to pound heavily against my ribs. The old dormant instincts of the forensic investigator suddenly woke up screaming inside my head. I opened the truck door and stepped out into the freezing rain. I walked toward the heavy steel door of the abandoned warehouse. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming anticipation of what my dying wife had hidden from me. I slid the brass key into the rusted padlock. It clicked open smoothly. I pushed the heavy metal door upward, the rusty tracks groaning loudly in the empty industrial lot. I stepped inside the dark space and fumbled for a light switch. The single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life, illuminating a scene that stole my breath. It wasn't a storage unit filled with old furniture or forgotten belongings. This was a laboratory. A fully equipped, high-tech laboratory, complete with gleaming stainless steel surfaces, complex machinery, and monitors displaying intricate data. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the precise organization, the detailed charts, the scientific journals stacked neatly on a workbench. And then I saw it. On the central table, beneath a clear glass dome, was a prototype of a medical device. It was sleek, futuristic, and utterly familiar. It was the device my son, Terrence, had been working on for years in our garage, the one he called the Lifeline. He had poured his heart and soul into that project, a revolutionary diagnostic tool for early cancer detection. He had been so close to a breakthrough, but then, about 2 years ago, he'd given up, claiming the research was a dead end. My wife, Yvonne, a gentle, quiet woman who spent her days tending her garden and volunteering at the local library, had been secretly continuing his work. Not just continuing it, but perfecting it. The data on the screens showed advanced stages of development, far beyond where Terrence had left off. There were notes in her elegant handwriting, calculations, and diagrams. And then I saw a small, framed photograph on the workbench. Terrence, beaming, holding an early model of the Lifeline. Beside it, a handwritten note from Yvonne. "For my son, his legacy will not be stolen." The pieces began to click into place, forming a horrifying picture. Terrence had been working with a venture capital firm, Vanguard Tech Ventures, led by a man named Preston Sinclair. Savannah, my daughter-in-law, had been the one to introduce them. She'd always been overly ambitious, with an insatiable hunger for wealth and status. Terrence, blinded by his love for her and his passion for his work, had trusted them. But Yvonne, my astute and fiercely protective wife, had seen through their facade. She must have realized they were trying to steal his intellectual property, to claim his invention as their own. My mind raced back to the past 2 years. Yvonne's increasingly frequent garden club meetings that lasted late into the night, her hushed phone calls, her sudden interest in medical journals. I had dismissed it all as her finding new hobbies in her retirement. But she wasn't just finding hobbies. She was fighting a silent war. She was protecting her son, even as her own body was failing her. Victor, who had silently followed me inside, placed a hand on my shoulder. "She was a force, Warren," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me they were trying to push Terrence out, to take his work. She couldn't let that happen. She said you were too close to it, too emotionally invested, and they would see you coming. She needed someone they wouldn't expect, someone invisible. And that's when it hit me. My senile old mailman persona. The one I had cultivated for decades to keep myself and my family safe from the ghosts of my past. As a federal investigator, Yvonne had leveraged it. She knew my true capabilities, my sharp mind, my relentless pursuit of justice. She had built this secret lab, not just to finish Terrence's work, but to arm me with the evidence I would need to expose the thieves. She had planned for this moment, even as she was dying. She had prepared a weapon, And now, it was in my hands. The Atlanta Innovation Gala was held at the most exclusive luxury hotel in the heart of the downtown financial district. It was a massive, sprawling venue, reserved only for the highest echelons of corporate power. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open the heavy doors of imported sports cars and stretched limousines, guiding the wealthy guests toward the red carpet. I didn't drive my rusted suburban sedan to the front door. I took a standard city cab, stepping out onto the wet pavement just a few yards away from the velvet ropes. The crisp evening air felt electric against my skin. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal pinstriped suit, the armor I had not worn in over 2 decades, and walked right past the line of waiting billionaires with the supreme confidence of a man who owned the very ground they stood on. I pushed open the heavy brass double doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. The sheer opulence of the room was designed to intimidate. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant golden light over the sea of wealthy guests. Waiters glided silently across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays of vintage champagne and delicate appetizers. But the most prominent feature in the room was a giant digital banner projecting across the back wall. It read, "Vanguard Tech Ventures, the future of medical innovation." Directly beneath that banner, resting on a lighted pedestal, was a sleek glass display case, holding the prototype of the revolutionary medical device my son Terrence had spent 5 agonizing years building in our garage. They were actively celebrating the theft of my son's life work. They were preparing to publicly claim his absolute genius as their own. The room was packed tightly with the elite class of Atlanta. Venture capitalists, powerful politicians, and arrogant corporate titans mingled and laughed. It was a sea of wealthy white privilege. They were sipping expensive champagne and exchanging fake pleasantries, completely unaware that they were currently celebrating a massive federal crime. And then I stepped fully into the light. Even in my immaculate custom-tailored suit, I stood out like a blaring warning siren. I was a 73-year-old African-American man stepping uninvited into a highly guarded sanctuary, built on generational wealth and systemic exclusion. The gentle hum of the classical string quartet continued to play from the corner, but the arrogant conversations nearest to the grand entrance suddenly died down. Eyes turned toward me. I felt their heavy, judgmental stares scanning my face, my skin, and my completely unapologetic presence. They didn't see a retired federal investigator capable of destroying their financial portfolios. They saw a glaring anomaly. They saw an old black man who must have surely wandered past the security desk by mistake. The subtle whispers of prejudice rippled through the crowd. I didn't shrink under their heavy gazes. I didn't lower my head. I walked forward with the slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying stride of an apex predator returning to his natural hunting ground. I scanned the massive room, searching for my targets. Right in the absolute center, standing on a slightly elevated platform, were the 2 people I had come to utterly destroy. Preston Sinclair, the corrupt chief executive, was wearing a sharp velvet tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon and laughing loudly at a joke made by a city senator. Standing right beside him, holding his arm with zero shame, was my treacherous daughter-in-law, Savannah. She was wearing a stunning backless silver evening gown, dripping in heavy diamonds that were undeniably purchased with the money she had violently stolen from my son. They were holding court, receiving early congratulations for the brilliant medical project they were about to publicly unveil. Savannah turned her head to grab another glass of champagne from a passing waiter. As she turned, her eyes swept casually across the ballroom floor, her gaze locked directly onto mine. I stopped walking and simply stood there 20 feet away, holding the heavy, dark brown manila envelope firmly in my right hand. The bright, triumphant smile on her perfectly made-up face instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her eyes widened in absolute shock and pure, unadulterated panic. Her brain simply couldn't comprehend what she was looking at. In her twisted and cruel reality, I was supposed to be securely locked inside my dark bedroom, starving, severely dehydrated, and descending into total mental madness, waiting for a psychiatric ambulance to carry me away at dawn. Yet here I was, standing tall, powerful and impeccably dressed, infiltrating her perfect night of stolen glory. The panic quickly morphed into a furious, violent rage. She whispered something urgently to Preston, dropped his arm, and marched aggressively through the wealthy crowd toward me. Her silver dress flowed behind her like a toxic storm cloud. She stopped just inches from my face, completely ignoring the curious, disgusted stares of the wealthy investors standing nearby. She kept her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper, desperately trying to avoid making a public scene, but her body was literally shaking with fury. "What in the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her blue eyes flashing with pure, unfiltered hatred. "How did you get out of that locked room? Who let this savage old man inside this building? You are supposed to be locked away, you crazy, senile fool. You are ruining everything." I didn't answer her. I just looked down at her with a calm, empty expression, letting her toxic anger boil over. I simply lifted the manila envelope, letting its weight speak volumes. Savannah's eyes darted to it, then back to my face, a flicker of fear replacing her rage. She knew I wasn't just an old man who had wandered in. She knew I was here for a reason. Preston Sinclair, sensing the shift in the room's energy, excused himself from the senator and approached us, a forced smile plastered on his face. "Savannah, darling, is everything all right?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he took me in. He recognized me, of course, from the few times I'd been at Terrence's house. He saw the senile old mailman persona, but the manila envelope in my hand clearly disturbed him. This is Warren," Savannah stammered, her voice still a whisper, but now laced with desperation. "Terrence's father. He's not well. He shouldn't be here." I cut her off, my voice clear and resonant, carrying just enough to draw the attention of those closest to us. "Preston Sinclair," I said, my gaze fixed on his. "I believe you have something that belongs to my son." His fake smile faltered. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Mr. Hayes. Vanguard Tech Ventures is proud to be unveiling a groundbreaking medical innovation tonight, a product of years of dedicated research and development." He gestured vaguely towards the display case holding the Lifeline prototype. "Indeed," I replied, my voice calm, almost conversational. "A groundbreaking innovation that my son, Terrence Hayes, spent 5 years developing in his garage. An innovation that your company, Vanguard Tech Ventures, systematically stole from him, with the assistance of your co-conspirator, Savannah Hayes." A collective gasp rippled through the small circle of onlookers. Savannah's face went white. Preston's jaw tightened. "This is preposterous," he boomed, trying to regain control. "This old man is clearly delusional." "Security." But before security could react, I opened the manila envelope. Inside were neatly organized documents, each one a nail in their carefully constructed coffin. "These are the original patents for the Lifeline, filed by Terrence Hayes 5 years ago," I announced, holding up a document. "These are the detailed schematics and research notes, all bearing my son's signature and dated long before Vanguard Tech Ventures ever entered the picture." I held up another sheaf of papers. "And these," I continued, my voice hardening, "are the forensic audit reports from my wife's secret laboratory, detailing the exact modifications and improvements she made to Terrence's original design, proving that your groundbreaking innovation is nothing more than a stolen, slightly altered version of his work." The whispers in the crowd grew louder, turning into a murmur of shock and disbelief. Preston's face was a mask of furious panic. Savannah stood frozen, her expensive dress now looking like a shroud. "And finally," I said, pulling out a small flash drive, "this contains a complete digital trail of your financial transactions, Preston, detailing the illicit payments made to Savannah in exchange for her assistance in defrauding my son. It also includes recordings of your private conversations, where you openly discuss your plans to discredit Terrence and claim his invention as your own." I held up the flash drive, a tiny, unassuming object that held the power to bring down an empire. "I believe the FBI and the SEC will find this information very illuminating." The room erupted. The classical music stopped. People started shouting. Cameras flashed, and the carefully constructed facade of the gala crumbled into chaos. Preston Sinclair was surrounded by reporters and angry investors, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and terror. Savannah, utterly exposed, tried to melt into the crowd, but her silver gown and heavy diamonds made her an easy target. My son Terence, who had just arrived, pushed through the throng, his eyes wide with confusion and then dawning horror as he saw Savannah, then Preston, and finally me, standing amidst the wreckage. He looked at me, then at the display case, then back at me, 1,000 questions in his eyes. I simply gave him a small, sad smile, a silent promise that I would explain everything. The invisibility of being an old black man in America is a heavy burden to carry, but if you know how to use it, that invisibility becomes your absolute greatest weapon. I let them believe their own arrogant lies. I let them think they were the apex predators hunting a weak, helpless animal. I put on the disguise of the confused, retired mailman, and I walked right past their security desks, into their private offices, and deep into their encrypted bank accounts, without anyone ever noticing my presence. True justice is never born from loud, explosive anger. Savannah operated on pure toxic emotion. She threw theatrical tantrums. She smashed doors with heavy hammers, and she screamed violently in hotel hallways when she finally lost control. But loud anger is incredibly sloppy. It blinds you to your own mistakes, and it leaves massive holes in your defense. I learned decades ago, in the high-stakes halls of the federal government, that the absolute greatest revenge is a meticulously prepared truth. You don't need to yell or scream when you have the undeniable facts resting quietly in your inner pocket. You don't need to throw a physical punch when you can completely freeze a billionaire's bank account with a single phone call. You simply let the arrogant predators build their own elaborate traps. You let them step inside, and then you quietly lock the heavy steel door right behind them. I stood up from the grave, brushing the loose blades of green grass from the knees of my trousers. I looked down at the white rose resting peacefully against the gray stone. The bloodhound had successfully completed his final hunt. The federal executioner was officially retired and safely buried deep underground. I was just Warren again, a proud father, a devoted widower, and a man who simply wanted to spend his remaining years tending to his garden and watching his brilliant son change the world. I turned away from the headstone and walked slowly back across the quiet cemetery toward my rusted old pickup truck. I opened the heavy metal door, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The old motor rumbled to life, a steady, comforting sound. I drove out of the iron gates and headed back toward my quiet home on the south side of Atlanta. I rolled down the window, letting the warm Georgia breeze wash over my face. For the first time in 2 long years, I had absolutely nothing to hide and absolutely nothing to fight. The profound, unbreakable peace had finally returned, and it belonged entirely to me. True power does not scream for attention. It waits in the absolute silence of observation. When you judge a person by the wrinkles on their face, the color of their skin, or the simplicity of their clothes, you risk underestimating the brilliant mind hidden beneath. My daughter-in-law mistook my quiet demeanor for senility and my patience for weakness. She let arrogance blind her, forgetting that the most lethal chess players never reveal their moves until checkmate is inevitable. Character is not measured by the luxury you wear, but by the integrity you uphold. In the end, those who build their empires on deceit will inevitably be crushed by the heavy, silent weight of the truth. Never mistake an old man's silence for surrender.